Hello, today we're going to talk about the planes of motion. When we study the various joints of the body in the kinesiology, it's helpful to be able to characterize them according to specific planes of motion. The definition of a plane of motion is an imaginary two-dimensional surface, like a plane of glass or my plane of cardboard here, through which a limb or body segment is moved. So if you go ahead and stand in front of the cutout there, just imagine that I slid this through the middle of his body. And the first plane we're going to talk about is the frontal plane. This is the frontal plane. If I slid this right through his ears. Movements that you can do in the frontal plane are anything that you would do that your body is sliding along this plane or this piece of cardboard. Examples are lateral neck flexion, shoulder AB and adduction, and hip AB and adduction. Now, when we talk about planes of motion, we also want to talk about the axis of rotation. The axis of rotation is an imaginary line that will go at a 90-degree angle to the plane of motion. So along with the frontal plane of motion, always goes the sagittal axis of rotation. So if you can imagine my dowel pin here going straight through his body, that's my sagittal axis of rotation. The next plane of motion is the sagittal plane of motion. Imagine that I slid this piece of cardboard right straight through the middle of his body. The axis of rotation for sagittal plane of motion is the frontal axis of rotation. So anything he does spins around this frontal and rubs along the sagittal plane of motion. Examples of actions that you can do in the sagittal plane of motion are shoulder flexion, elbow flexion, hip flexion, good. Now step out to the side a little bit. Other actions that you can do are neck flexion and extension, trunk flexion and extension, and knee flexion and extension. The last plane of motion we're going to talk about is the transverse plane of motion. Imagine that I slid this straight through the middle of his body. That's the transverse plane of motion. The transverse plane of motion has a vertical axis of rotation. Imagine this going through the top of his head all the way down to his feet. Motions that you can do in the transverse plane of motion are all rotational movements. So you can do trunk rotation, cervical rotation. You can also do shoulder and hip internal and external rotation.